What if history didn't lie about their genius, but lied about how they died? We are taught to remember great figures at their brightest moments, when their talent reshaped culture, when their names became immortal. History prefers its legends polished and complete. What it rarely tells us is what happened at the end, when decline set in, when behavior became unsettling, and when the truth became inconvenient. Before antibiotics existed, one disease quietly ravaged the world's elite: artists, writers, industrialists, and thinkers whose minds helped define entire eras. Syphilis was once widespread, yet deeply stigmatized. It was treated not merely as an illness, but as a moral failing. Because of that shame, its diagnosis was often erased. Death certificates listed safer explanations: pneumonia, stroke, nervous exhaustion, while the underlying cause disappeared from the record. Syphilis earned the name the Great Imitator for a reason. In its late stages, it could look like alcoholism, eccentric genius, mental collapse, or simple madness. Families stayed silent. Doctors faced pressure. Early biographers quietly agreed that some truths were better left unspoken. Over time, those silences hardened into official history. What remains today is a version of the past that feels coherent, but incomplete. A history that explains brilliance, yet disguises deterioration. In this film, we revisit 5 legendary figures whose final years have long been misunderstood, and we ask an uncomfortable question. How many great minds were not destroyed by fate, but by a disease history chose to forget? Al Capone built one of the most powerful criminal empires in American history, not through chaos, but through precision. At the height of Prohibition, he controlled Chicago with an efficiency that resembled corporate management more than street crime. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution. His operations generated an estimated $100 million a year, the modern equivalent of billions. Rival gangs failed to eliminate him. Law enforcement failed to imprison him for his crimes. Even the federal government struggled, ultimately resorting to tax evasion charges when murder indictments proved impossible. Capone appeared untouchable. Bullets missed him. Enemies vanished before they could strike. Yet the force that ultimately destroyed him was neither a rival nor a courtroom. It was a microscopic bacterium he had likely contracted decades earlier. Medical records confirmed that Capone suffered from advanced neurosyphilis. By the time he was imprisoned at Alcatraz in the early 1930s, doctors noted clear signs of paresis, a form of late-stage syphilitic brain damage. This was not speculation. Prison physicians documented severe cognitive decline, memory impairment, and emotional instability. The disease had been quietly progressing for years, attacking the very organ that had made Capone formidable: his mind. During his final years in prison, Capone underwent repeated mental evaluations. The results were devastating. Once a strategic thinker capable of managing a criminal empire with military discipline, he now struggled with basic arithmetic and simple conversations. Medical assessments suggested his intellectual functioning had regressed to that of a child. Guards and doctors alike observed childlike behavior, irrational mood swings, and episodes of confusion that bordered on delusion. After his release in 1939, the deterioration became impossible to hide. Capone withdrew from public life and retreated to his estate in Florida. Friends and family described a man who no longer understood the world around him. He would fish in his swimming pool, convinced he was catching enormous trophies. He spoke to people who were not there. The legendary temper that once intimidated Chicago's underworld dissolved into emotional unpredictability. When Capone died in January 1947, his death certificate listed stroke and pneumonia as the causes. These were not false, but they were incomplete. The underlying condition that had reduced America's most feared gangster to a confused, childlike figure was neurosyphilis. The true cause never appeared in the official record. The irony is brutal. By the mid-1940s, penicillin had already proven effective in treating syphilis. A simple course of antibiotics could have stopped the infection if it had been administered earlier. But for Capone, treatment came too late. The damage to his brain was irreversible. If prison, rivals, and the federal government could not stop Al Capone, what did? Not justice. Not violence. A disease history rarely associates with power, yet one that proved utterly unstoppable. Capone's story matters, not because he was a criminal, but because his case is undeniable. It establishes a medical truth that cannot be dismissed. And once that truth is accepted, a disturbing possibility emerges. If syphilis could dismantle the most powerful gangster in America, how many other legends felt the same way, without anyone noticing? If Al Capone's decline unfolded largely behind closed doors, John Barrymore's collapse played out in front of cameras, colleagues, and audiences who never fully understood what they were witnessing. Where Capone ruled through fear, Barrymore ruled through brilliance. He was not merely a star, he was theatrical royalty. A man whose performances redefined Shakespeare for American audiences, and whose profile became synonymous with classical masculine beauty. At his peak, Barrymore was regarded as one of the greatest actors of his generation. His command of language was legendary. He could perform Hamlet from memory, captivate a room with effortless wit, and shift between comedy and tragedy with ease. Yet, by the late 1930s, something had begun to fracture. The change was not gradual. It was sudden, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The official explanation arrived quickly and conveniently. John Barrymore, the story went, had destroyed himself with alcohol. Hollywood had seen that narrative before, and it required no uncomfortable questions. Excess, indulgence, and personal weakness fit neatly into the mythology of a fallen star. But the details of Barrymore's decline tell a different story, one that alcoholism alone cannot explain. Heavy drinking does not typically erase memory at the speed Barrymore experienced. Within a few short years, he was no longer able to remember his lines. Entire scenes evaporated from his mind moments after rehearsal. His once razor-sharp intellect became unreliable, alternating between flashes of clarity and profound confusion. Colleagues described mood swings that seemed disconnected from intoxication, moments of lucidity followed by alarming disorientation. Behind the scenes, Hollywood scrambled to protect its investment. Studios hired cue men, handlers, whose sole responsibility was to feed Barrymore his lines through concealed prompts. Scenes were broken into fragments, filmed out of sequence, stitched together in editing to disguise the extent of his cognitive collapse. On screen, the illusion held. Off-screen, the reality was undeniable. Medical historians now argue that Barrymore's symptoms align closely with neurosyphilis, a late-stage infection that attacks the brain. Memory loss, personality changes, erratic behavior, and progressive cognitive decline form a pattern that fits the disease with unsettling precision. Barrymore's lifestyle, marked by extraordinary sexual freedom in an era when syphilis was widespread and heavily stigmatized, placed him squarely in the highest risk category. Acknowledging that possibility, however, came at a cost Hollywood was unwilling to pay. Syphilis was still viewed as a moral stain, not a medical condition. To admit that one of America's most revered actors was suffering from it would have threatened not only his reputation, but the dignity of an entire theatrical dynasty. Alcoholism, by comparison, was almost respectable. Doctors faced pressure, studios demanded discretion, family members remained silent, and biographers, writing in a culture that preferred restraint over truth, reinforced the version of events that caused the least damage. The result was a narrative that blamed Barrymore himself, rather than the disease that was steadily dismantling his mind. John Barrymore died in 1942 at the age of 60. His death certificate cited cirrhosis and kidney failure. Once again, the immediate causes were not false, but they obscured a deeper reality. Neurosyphilis may not have acted alone, but it likely worked in tandem with alcohol, accelerating the collapse and masking its true origin. If Capone's case proved that syphilis could destroy power, Barrymore's story reveals something equally disturbing. When forced to choose between truth and dignity, history often chooses the lie that sounds better. And in doing so, it leaves us remembering decline as weakness rather than illness. Unlike Capone or Barrymore, Howard Hughes did not collapse in the shadows or on a soundstage. His decline unfolded across decades, slowly transforming one of America's most celebrated visionaries into a figure of near mythical isolation. Hughes was not just wealthy, he was a symbol of boundless ambition. Aviator, industrialist, film producer, and technological innovator, his name was synonymous with modern American genius. In his early years, Hughes was already unconventional. He slept irregularly, obsessed over details, and pushed his body to extremes. Yet, eccentricity alone did not prevent him from flying record-breaking aircraft, running major corporations, or reshaping Hollywood. For a long time, his oddities appeared to be the tolerable quirks of brilliance. What followed, however, went far beyond eccentric behavior. By the 1950s and 1960s, Hughes's condition had shifted dramatically. Paranoia intensified. Obsessive-compulsive rituals multiplied. He withdrew from nearly all human contact, sealing himself inside hotel rooms where he controlled light, sound, temperature, and movement with rigid precision. Staff members received pages of handwritten instructions detailing how to open cans of fruit or deliver objects without contamination. These were no longer the habits of a demanding genius. They were symptoms of a mind losing its ability to regulate reality. A growing number of medical historians and psychiatrists have suggested that Hughes's behavior is consistent with late-stage neurosyphilis, particularly a form known as dementia paralytica. This condition erodes judgment, impulse control, and self-care while amplifying paranoia and compulsive behavior. The timeline fits disturbingly well. Untreated syphilis can remain dormant for decades before entering its tertiary stage, often surfacing in middle age with devastating neurological consequences. Hughes's lifestyle during his Hollywood years offered ample opportunity for infection. He was famously promiscuous at a time when syphilis was still widespread and frequently undiagnosed. While no definitive medical record confirms the disease, the pattern of symptoms, combined with the era in which he lived, makes the hypothesis difficult to dismiss. One event may have accelerated the unraveling. In 1946, Hughes survived a catastrophic plane crash that left him with severe injuries, including head trauma. Neurological damage from such an accident can exacerbate or trigger latent conditions. In a body already compromised, the crash may have pushed a dormant confection into rapid progression. As Hughes's condition worsened, proper medical intervention became increasingly unlikely. The doctors surrounding him were not independent physicians. They were employees. Their livelihoods depended on Hughes's approval. Pressing him to undergo testing for a stigmatized disease carried enormous risk. At the same time, Hughes himself grew deeply distrustful of medical professionals, often refusing to see them in person or rejecting treatment outright. By the end of his life, the physical deterioration matched the psychological collapse. Once tall and athletic, Hughes weighed barely 90 pounds. His hair and fingernails grew grotesquely long. Malnutrition, infection, and neglect consumed him, despite a fortune capable of purchasing anything imaginable. Wealth bought privacy. It bought silence. What it could not buy was an honest diagnosis delivered early enough to matter. Hughes died in 1976, officially from kidney failure. The deeper cause remains buried beneath layers of secrecy and speculation. Whether syphilis was the primary driver or a catastrophic contributor, the lesson is the same. Power does not protect against disease. Money does not guarantee truth. And sometimes, the very structures built to preserve control ensure that help never arrives. Howard Hughes's deterioration unfolded behind locked doors and guarded secrecy. Edgar Allan Poe's final collapse, by contrast, spilled into the streets. It was public, chaotic, and unresolved, an ending as disturbing as the stories that made him immortal.
Poe's death in 1849 remains one of the great mysteries in American literary history. He was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, dressed in clothes that were not his own, unable to explain where he had been or how he arrived there. Over the next 4 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, suffering hallucinations, confusion, and intense agitation. He repeatedly called out for someone named Reynolds, a figure never identified. Then, at just 40 years old, he died.
For generations, explanations multiplied. Alcoholism, rabies, carbon monoxide poisoning, even political violence. Each theory attempted to impose order on a death that resisted clarity, yet none fully accounted for the totality of Poe's symptoms or the troubling pattern that preceded them.
In the years leading up to his death, Poe's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He experienced sudden mood swings, memory lapses, and episodes of profound disorientation. Contrary to his reputation as a habitual drunk, contemporaries noted something unusual. Poe had an extremely low tolerance for alcohol. Even small amounts could render him visibly impaired. Modern neurologists recognize this hypersensitivity as a common feature of neurosyphilis, caused by damage to the brain's blood vessels and regulatory systems.
The medical context of Poe's era matters. In mid-19th century urban centers, syphilis was widespread. Some estimates suggest that as many as 10% of city populations carried the infection. Poe's years at the University of Virginia and his time in military service placed him squarely within high-risk environments. Infection could remain dormant for years, sometimes decades, before advancing to its most destructive neurological stage. One form in particular, meningovascular syphilis, can trigger delirium, seizures, confusion, and sudden neurological collapse. Poe's death certificate listed phrenitis, or brain inflammation, a diagnosis consistent with this condition. At the time, such language often served as a discreet substitute for naming syphilis directly, sparing families and reputations from public disgrace. Social factors may have delivered the final blow. Poe died during a period when a practice known as cooping was common, election-related abductions in which victims were drugged or forced to drink, then moved between polling locations. For a healthy person, such abuse was dangerous. For someone with compromised neurological health, it could be fatal. Syphilis need not have been the sole cause of death to be the decisive factor that made survival impossible. What makes Poe's case uniquely haunting is how closely his art mirrors his condition. His stories dwell on fractured consciousness, paranoia, hallucinations, and the terror of losing control of one's own mind. Works like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher do not merely imagine madness, they inhabit it with unsettling precision. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Poe may not have been inventing these mental states. He may have been documenting them. Unlike Hughes, Poe had no wealth to shield him. Unlike Barrymore, no studio stood ready to preserve an illusion. His decline was witnessed in fragments, misunderstood, and ultimately reduced to a mystery. What remains is a legacy shaped by brilliance, and a death shaped by silence. By the time Poe's story ends, a pattern has become impossible to ignore. Genius fades, behavior shifts, explanations grow convenient, and the disease itself vanishes from the record. Where Edgar Allan Poe's final days dissolved into confusion, Oscar Wilde's decline unfolded with devastating clarity. His mind remained sharp, articulate, and painfully aware as his body steadily failed him. That imbalance, intellect intact while physical strength collapsed, defines the particular cruelty of Wilde's final years. By the early 1890s, Wilde stood at the height of literary fame. His plays dominated London theaters, his essays shaped public debate, and his wit made him a central figure of high society. That world vanished in 1895, when he was arrested and imprisoned for gross indecency. The sentence destroyed his career, severed his income, and inflicted lasting damage on his health. Prison life was harsh and unforgiving,
Hard labor, malnutrition, and untreated illness accelerated a physical decline that may have already been underway. When Wilde was released, he entered exile, socially disgraced, financially ruined, and largely abandoned. Friends who encountered him in France described a man whose conversation remained brilliant, even dazzling, while his body visibly deteriorated.
Medical historians have long debated the nature of Wilde's illness. Although definitive records are scarce, many believe his symptoms align with late-stage syphilis, particularly the meningovascular form. This variation damages the blood vessels supplying the brain, producing neurological complications alongside systemic physical collapse. Crucially, it often spares intellect until late in the disease, allowing the patient to remain mentally lucid while enduring progressive physical breakdown.
Wilde's final years were marked by chronic pain, recurring infections, and growing weakness. An ear infection spread to the membranes surrounding his brain, leading to cerebral inflammation. His official cause of death in 1900 was listed as meningitis. At the time, such diagnoses frequently served as discrete stand-ins for underlying conditions considered too shameful to name. Syphilis, especially in a man already condemned as morally deviant, could not be acknowledged publicly.
Beyond the disease itself, society played a decisive role in sealing Wilde's fate. He was not merely ill, he was excluded. Medical treatment required money he no longer had, and physicians willing to treat a disgraced figure without fear of association. Many were not. Stigma did not end with his prison sentence. It followed him into exile, quietly ensuring that meaningful care remained out of reach.
Despite everything, Wilde's mind resisted surrender. Visitors recalled conversations filled with irony and insight. One of his final remarks, delivered while gazing at the peeling wallpaper of his Paris hotel room, captured the tragedy with cruel elegance. "One of us has to go." It was humor as defiance, wit as a final act of control.
The irony of Wilde's life is impossible to ignore. The picture of Dorian Gray explored the idea of hidden decay, a corruption that consumes its subject while the surface remains untouched. In reality, Wilde's intellect remained luminous while his body bore the full cost of disease, punishment, and neglect. The decay was no longer hidden. It was simply ignored. Penicillin, which would later render syphilis curable, lay decades in the future. Yet even within the limits of his time, Wilde's death was not inevitable. A disease weakened him. Society ensured he would not recover. He died fully aware of what he had lost: his career, his health, and the world that once celebrated him. With Oscar Wilde, the pattern reaches its most painful conclusion. Power did not protect. Fame invited concealment. Genius inspired excuses. And when illness met shame, silence finished what disease began. By the time penicillin transformed syphilis into a treatable infection, it was already too late for countless lives. Before that medical turning point, the disease moved quietly through history, reshaping destinies while leaving little trace behind. What made it so destructive was not only its biology, but the silence surrounding it. Shame, fear, and reputation often mattered more than truth. Across these 5 stories, a pattern emerges: extraordinary talent followed by unexplained decline, behaviors dismissed as excess, eccentricity, or weakness, medical realities replaced with cleaner narratives. In each case, society chose comfort over accuracy. It was easier to blame alcohol, madness, or personal failure than to confront an illness that challenged moral norms and social order. The cultural cost of that silence is impossible to calculate. How many plays were never written? How many inventions never designed? How many ideas faded before they could fully form? These were not minor figures lost to obscurity. They were minds that shaped art, industry, and literature, cut down not by fate alone, but by secrecy. History often asks us to admire greatness without examining its fragility. But understanding how these lives truly ended does not diminish their legacy. It restores their humanity. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think history still hides uncomfortable truths like these? Which story affected you the most, and why? Share your thoughts, questions, and perspectives in the comments below. Your voice is part of this conversation.